Welcome! If you're a woman who has a sense that there's more out there for you, you're in the right place. I'm Whitney Baker, host of the Electric Ideas podcast. Somewhere along the line of work and kids, life carried on, but I lost track of my truth. I'm on a reflective journey, and that's what this podcast is all about. Each week, I interview a woman who is lighting her own path and offering others hope. Before our conversation ends, we'll share a reflective question for you to explore. Sometimes all we need is a jolt, a fresh idea, an aha moment that connects us to a sense of possibility. This, my friends, is what I call an electric idea. Welcome back to Electric Ideas. I'm your host, Whitney Baker, and I am so excited about today's episode because we are going to talk about how to navigate this era of distraction we are all living in and how it might be impacting our attention span, specifically as it relates to our ability to read and enjoy books. Joining me on the show today is cultural and literary critic Mia Levitin. Mia reviews books regularly for publications including the Financial Times, Monocle, and the TLS. She's also author of a book called The Future of Seduction. In this episode, we talk a lot about how our phones are designed to hijack our attention. If you want additional depth on this aspect of the conversation, you might enjoy going back and checking out episode 97 of the Electric Ideas podcast with Dr. Jody Halpern, where we talk about whether or not social media and AI bridge the gap of loneliness or widen it. But for this conversation, I really love the invitation to reclaim our reading habits. Mia is a super interesting person, and she reminds us that reading offers a kind of nourishment that our scrolling brains are actually starving for. I love books. This was a super meaningful conversation for me, and I hope it is for you too. Let's get into it. Hi, Mia. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Whitney.
I want to start off by sharing a quote from a recent Financial Times article that you wrote in the arts section. It says, "My job as a book critic used to elicit envy at cocktail parties, with people fantasizing about a life spent reading. Now, it's more likely to trigger sheepish admissions from partygoers about not reading as much as they'd like to, as if I'm going to spring a pop quiz on Moby Dick." I just wanted to start here. That brought a smile to my face. What's been your experience with interacting with people and telling them what they do, and how has it shifted?
Well, I have to say, first of all, I'm a career changer. So I have been reviewing books for about 7 years now. And I kind of noticed, in the beginning, it was really everybody's dream job. And more recently, and, very recently, in the last year or 2 years, I've noticed all of a sudden that, even at literary parties, even among novelists, among publishers, people are just admitting that they don't read as much as they'd like. And the statistics bear that out. So in the UK, for example, 35% of people surveyed said that they were lapsed readers. So this is people who used to enjoy reading and no longer have the habit. So I think we're kind of living through really like a precipitous drop in that activity that people used to find pleasurable. And not only pleasurable, but as the research shows, like is fundamental to kind of our cognitive processes. And, if you think about the long-term implications to democracy, self-reflection, like it is quite shocking.
Yeah, I feel like there is almost a shame in people that, I used to be a reader, and they don't even want to go there. Is that what you've experienced?
Absolutely. And I think, reading should be a pleasure. Nobody's saying it should be like vegetables, like, which the sad thing is, if somebody were saying like, listen, I'm sitting down like joyfully and spending 2 hours on YouTube or TikTok or Instagram or, pick your poison. The problem is, I think most people are finding that not satisfying, right? A lot of your day is taken up by something that ultimately feels icky or, isn't nourishing you or developing you in the ways that you want to be, like the long-term satisfaction. So, Oxford's word of the year last year was brain rot, which describes both the content and the effect of that content of these kind of viral clips, thanks to an uptick in 230% in usage. So we are, I think, reaching a critical point in terms of the brain's capacity to read.
Wow, that is a staggering statistic. I did a little research too, and just to echo the research on leisure reading dropping, I read a statistic that the Pew Research Center said that adults ages 18 to 34, that reading for pleasure has dropped 20% since the 2000s. And as you mentioned, social media is cited as the primary competitor for time and attention. So we all know that social media is kind of geared to hijack our attention, to give us dopamine hits. But was there anything hopeful that you discovered in talking to people in terms of trying to reclaim this space or make better habits around social media so that we are doing something fulfilling with our time?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the reaction to the article in and of itself was really hopeful because people it really resonated and they felt, I had so many people write to me and say, listen, I've made a resolution to read more this year. And the reality is, like, it doesn't take so much. So, just an hour extra reading a day, clawed back from the 4 hours that we spend on the phone on average, would put you in the top 1% of readers, right? So, we're not talking about having to like quit your job and read all day. And another positive aspect is audiobooks. So, audiobooks continue to see massive growth year on year, double digit growth. They've grown with some 500% in the past decade or something crazy like that. An interesting thing about audiobooks is it's like grabbing a new audience. So fiction tends to be read primarily by women, but audiobooks, the growth is attributed to younger or youngish men. So it's a lot of nonfiction. And the other interesting thing about audio is that from a brain perspective, it activates the same parts of the brain that reading print does. So all the benefits that you get from reading, from relaxation of the nervous system to empathy to back to what I said, critical thinking, all of those, you still get the benefits from audiobooks. So that's helpful for people who are struggling to find the time because they can do that on their commute or, ideally not multitasking. But if you're doing something very low level, I don't know, folding laundry or something where you can still pay attention to the book, at least that gives you another in that doesn't require you to be seated and reading.
That's really helpful because I've been curious about that because I'm someone who always has a paper book going and always has an audiobook. And I even feel a little sheepish about it sometimes. Like I feel like I'm cheating on my books when I'm listening to audio. So that's really actually reassuring.
Absolutely not. However, you can get them in, right? It's like pureeing the veggies. Do you have a certain book that you would read on audio versus print? Like, does it tend to be fiction or nonfiction, or how do you decide?
I think a lot of people probably do it the opposite, but it really depends what I'm in the mood for. Sometimes I like to read fiction before bed because it's just a little bit more relaxing for me. And depending on what's going on, I get to read nonfiction for work. And sometimes I want to consume that during the day when I'm more likely to be on audio. So I toggle back and forth. How about you?
I'm not an audio person, but again, not because I have any snobbery around it, but just because I'm such a visual learner. So one of the people I interviewed for the piece I wrote was a bibliotherapist, and they found that brains have a tendency to be either more audio based, kinetic, or visual. And I'm just kind of a very classically visual person. So even for me, like to read, I prefer a print book because for me personally, I find that digital reading, I tend to skim more because that's what the brain has been trained to do based on all the screen information, the masses of quantities of information we're taking in on screens. And also, memory sits in the hippocampus, which is also where geography is. So, for example, like London cab drivers who have a very difficult test to pass in order to get their license, they have very overdeveloped hippocampi because their geography is really developed. So, Alzheimer's, when people lose their memory and they get lost, those are in the same part of the brain. So all that to say that a physical book, just by virtue of reading, having the physical book in your hand, you tend to remember subconsciously where something was in the book. And that kind of helps your brain remember it better.
That's fascinating. Oh my gosh, because I used to have a digital reader and I completely have shifted back to having paper books because I just felt they felt different for me. So I'm glad to know
Yeah.
that there's
Yeah. There's a
research.
reason behind it. Yeah.
There's a
That being
reason.
said, I love my Kindle on holiday. Like on vacation, you could just the immediate access to the world's library is precious. So, again, no shade to people who have that preference. But for me personally, I just and for work as well, like when I'm reading to review a book, I much prefer print copy.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit more about the social media stuff and get your reaction to something. So, in his book called The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brains, author Nicholas Carr makes this huge point that scrolling social media kind of trains our brain to skim information versus read it. And you just mentioned that. So I'd like to pause and talk a bit more about that because I'll admit I've had this bad feeling sometimes when I'm reading my book that my brain almost wants to consume it more fast than is possible. And I'm getting
Interesting.
curious about it because as a big reader, I'm like, slow down, you're reading. Like, nope, we're reading one sentence at a time. And I'm finding it unnerving as someone who reads. And I'm just curious if you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. Well, I think one of the things that Carr was referring to is that when you scroll, there's no natural end point, which is why you find yourself going down this rabbit hole and spending hours unwittingly because there's no end. So a book has finite chapters or an end, but if you give it time, it will train your brain to slow down, but it's very hard for it to compete because even the content we consume on the phone. So for example, you're always seeing like the next thing out of the corner of your eye or an alert comes in and those things are designed by very clever people to grab your attention, right? Because there's a lot of money behind it. So my phone, for example, is in grayscale because all of a sudden, even my WhatsApp notifications, if it doesn't have that little red indication that I have a new message, just becomes a lot less interesting. Instagram, a lot less interesting in black and white. And so the kind of temptation is less engineered to grab me. And then, funnily enough, if you go to black and white and you turn the color back on, everything looks garish, like Las Vegas. It's like how quickly we get accustomed to that kind of level of overstimulation. But more specifically, like when I am tempted by my phone or kind of low energy and feel like that sort of superficial attention, I will put my phone in another room. An author friend I have actually locks his away in a timed safe. So like we're all in good company that this is a problem. So if he opens the safe, he breaks the safe and can't use it again. Like this is where
Yes.
we've come to, right?
Wow.
Like even the software you can override. So I physically distance myself from my phone. The author Brandon Taylor recommends building the habit back up by taking a non-phone timer. So, like a kitchen timer, some other alarm that's not your phone, and then starting with 10 minutes and then 20 and half an hour and then an hour. And so back to your point about feeling like your brain wants a different type of interaction, that is because that's what we're getting used to. It's like meditation, right? You sit down and at first you're so uncomfortable and your thoughts are going everywhere and your knees hurt and you're just like really, very rarely do you sink into that sweet spot right away. It's a training and it's like your mind is like a muscle. You go to the gym and you get stronger. And similarly, your reading skills improve when you do it on a regular basis. And then you kind of sink into that space of your brain knows what's happening, right? Your brain's not expecting that sort of shallow stimulation. And then it kind of can rest in that place.
Yes. Oh, this is getting into some of my favorite topics because it's messy. It's not perfect, but I'm trying to be really intentional about this as someone who does use social media, hopefully for good, but also wants to be intentional and wants to be able to have deep concentration and in person conversations and read. Something that I've explored is if I'm going to get on a social media platform, that I set a timer for a short amount of time for how much time I'm going to spend so that not only I don't unknowingly overspend time because it's built that way. And you can say, oh, I've got good habits, but I think it's easy. It's built to suck us in. But also it just brings this layer of intention. Like I have to make a conscious choice that I'm using it versus just fill the gaps because what I've found is I think it's a little bit of a vicious cycle. People are using social media instead of taking a real break during the day and just draining cognitive resources. And then by the time maybe at night, I know you don't have to read at night, but I know a lot of people, I think it's a healthy habit to read before bed, at least in my experience. People are feeling too drained to read, but it's just like a horrible cycle. So then I think some women feel too tired to read. So then they just scroll social media passively and it's pretty vicious. Can you
100%.
speak into that?
Absolutely. Well, one of my recommendations would be to kind of, again, create some intentionality around it. So the bibliotherapist whom I referred to earlier, she suggests having like a special reading nook in the house. So, like just as they recommend not taking your phone to bed, kind of keeping that space sacred. Similarly, like if you kind of have a little place to read with your favorite books, that is a sort of cognitive reminder of the pleasure that those books gave you, and the stories, and the characters you got to know, or the wisdom that some authors, if you had like your favorites around you. I personally find that the physical books, like, calm my nervous system. So I stayed at a dear friend's place in Brooklyn this summer, and I walked into her home and it was just filled with books, and I just felt my whole body go. So you can start reading a bit earlier. So I often find myself scrolling exactly at that time, 11 o'clock at night, when you're just not quite ready to go to bed. You probably should, but you just were looking for a little kind of hit of stimulation. So that's probably, if you can, the time to not go on the phone, because, as you said, it's very hard to discipline yourself. But, maybe start reading earlier before you hit that low point of energy. Another recommendation is to start small. So with something that makes you feel accomplished, like a short story or a novella. There's been a kind of resurgence of novellas, which are fantastic because, you can read them in one sitting and feel like it's not as daunting as a longer book. Some people prefer to be swept away in a long novel, but, it's a very personal choice. But you don't have to, again, like, it's not going to be quizzed. So,
Yeah.
whatever gets you back into the habit, by all means, go for it.
Hey, it's Whitney Baker from Electric Ideas, quickly popping into this episode because I'm wondering if you are someone who ever feels like life is pulling you in a million directions. Maybe you're feeling a bit disconnected, disappointed, or just frayed around the edges. If so, you are not alone, and I have a resource for you. I created a free 10 to Your Soul toolkit. It's a collection of simple, soul-nourishing practices designed to help you feel steady and self-connected, regardless of what's going on in the swirl of life. So if you're interested in snagging this toolkit, there's a link in the show notes from this podcast episode. Or if you want to just get a sense of what it's all about, you can go back a few episodes in the Electric Ideas podcast to episode 133, where I share a bit more perspective on these practices that are fairly consistent in my life and really support me. I know that life is full for many of you and that it can be a pain to click around and try to find things, especially when I want you to have plenty of time to read based on my conversation this week. So if you have any issues finding the link to the 10 to Your Soul toolkit, or you want me to send you a link to episode 133 of the podcast, or you just want to give me feedback and say hello, I'd love to hear from you. You can email me at whitney@myelectricideas.com. Okay, back to the episode. Yeah, you've talked a little bit, or a couple times you've mentioned this bibliotherapist. Can you talk in general? Just obviously people who have ever been readers know that there's a reason they like it and it's a fun pastime. But I think there's also a lot of science around how reading can be a healing tool. Can you speak into the relationship of like stress reduction and any other kind of more science-based aspects of why reading is good for us?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, the science is quite remarkable, because even 6 minutes of reading, as I said, calms the nervous system and has all the health benefits, lowers the heart rate. And, back to what I said about deep reading in terms of empathy and building that muscle. Because one of the things I think we're losing, for example, with the nonfiction book summary apps, which seem like a great idea because they seem like a time saver, but not everything's about efficiency. Not everything's about getting the bullet point version of self-help book or whatever, because ultimately any book is a conversation with the author. And in the same way that you would kind of, it would be rude to like pick up your phone in the middle of a conversation with somebody, brain really benefits by kind of matching the thinking process of the author. And that's kind of how we grow, and how one way, along with real life conversations, that we think new thoughts, right? Like, to me, that's one of the great joys of life. And so that too, from a kind of like hormonal perspective, is like exciting. It's maybe less immediate than the dopamine hit, but it's ultimately more satisfying. So, I reckon if you, at the end of the year, you've had whatever number of books that were meaningful to you, and you learned or you talked to people about it, book club, or I'll give you a good example, which I think might resonate with a lot of your audiences. Last year, like a kind of cult hit was Miranda July's All Fours, which, was one of the first books that really kind of dealt with perimenopause in fiction and desire in older women in this very frank way. She has an affair with a younger man. She has a queer affair. And it resonated with so many women I know, because it was a very brave representation of something on the page in fiction that literally had never been written about, or very little. So that's the kind of thing. It was a conversation spark. So whether or not you read it and you were in conversation with the book or you passed it to a friend and it was an opening to have that conversation, it became kind of a social phenomenon as well. So that connection, all the benefits we have of connection, which, we all know are, again, have huge benefits to health, you can get through the medium of, words on a page, which is kind of remarkable if you think about it, that it's been around for 2000 years, pretty much unchanged. And yet,
Yes.
it's changing in our lifetime very, very quickly, like how frightening for me anyway.
Yes. Oh, I want to reflect that back to you a little bit because I definitely am someone who gets those targeted ads like, be the smartest person today and sign up for some app and it's going to give you the quick hits from these nonfiction books. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but it definitely, for some reason, I've viscerally felt like leaned back from that. And now that you're talking, it is making me feel clear that it's almost just part of this whole like quick hit, overconsumption, overnight fix culture that is wrapped up in social media that I just don't really want to be a part of. And it's almost, as someone who appreciates books, it feels like a little bit of a disservice to the person who put so much heart and soul into creating something.
Absolutely. Well, it very much is. I mean, even from a kind of copyright standpoint, like how that's monetized without proper royalties to the author, and the fact that AI can summarize it incorrectly. Like there are a lot of ethical issues around those summary apps as well. But yeah, to your point, I think that ultimately, like the other thing you have to remember about social media is like even when it seems what you're being targeted with might be applicable, you're being led by an algorithm, and that algorithm doesn't have your best interests at heart, right? So the author David Ullen compared reading to, he called reading an act of resistance, like really a revolutionary act. So it's almost like we're claiming back our attention in age of distraction. And that's how it's come to feel like it's almost going to become subversive, which is so interesting because historically, at least in recent times, that hasn't been the case. But we're almost coming back full circle to like the original pamphlets being, passed around.
That took me back when I was a child. My mom was a retired English teacher, and I was always looking for ways to get out of chores, and she'd be calling me to do something. And then if she walked past me and I had a book in my hand, she wouldn't bug me. So I feel like and
That is an excellent hack for any parents out there, right? Like,
raising kids that read has been one of my feelings of biggest accomplishment as a mother in this distracted age. And listen, they're getting older and it's not as much as it used to be, but it just deeply makes me sad that even with young brains, I have a guess that there's going to be more research in coming years about how it's going to impact long term that these kids are growing up reading less, I'm assuming.
for sure. Yeah. I mean, I think there was that Atlantic article this year, which was shared quite shocking statistics about Ivy League literature students not being assigned full books anymore. So if like English lit majors aren't reading, like it doesn't bode well for the future of books. Although I've since talked to some kids who are studying English who assured me that they are, in fact, reading whole books. They might just be reading fewer of them and maybe not as long, but they are still reading. So hopefully, I mean, my hope, back to kind of a more upbeat, optimistic point, is that I do think that the phone is so toxic that we might be looking at the next cigarette insofar as whether it's legislative or social, all of a sudden it will become really uncool. And, it will continue to exist, but people will be ashamed of using it. And I'm hoping the pendulum swings back to real life because, you see it starting already with kind of schools resisting. And I think once that distraction isn't there, and again, the dopamine hit isn't as available, like, obviously there are always ways to distract yourself. But I think when you come back to a place of homeostasis and you kind of make choices that are more satisfying
Yeah.
for your body, right?
Yes. Ugh. You're speaking my language. I've thought about that pendulum. I was just hoping it was going to swing back before I had teenagers.
Teenagers, yeah. Yeah.
Doesn't look like it, but here's to hoping. I also, I know we've been chatting, but you talked about the social aspect of books, and I just wanted to share that. One thing I love about books is that so many people, especially women whose lives are full and they're working and they have jobs and they have kids, it's really easy to get stuck in these surface conversations. And I feel like when you have the shared experience of reading a book together, it's really easy just to open up a new area of conversation that feels a bit more meaningful. Like right away, you can just get into something really quickly. That's just one of the many reasons I'm still passionate about reading.
Absolutely. And I think that's also a reason to kind of, because sometimes people say, listen, like, okay, so if contemporary fiction dies, who cares? Because we have, millennia of great books and you couldn't read them in a lifetime anyway. And that's true. But I do think that contemporary fiction speaks to contemporary issues. And obviously, there's a bias to everything that remains from hundreds of years of who got published, right? So now you have experiences coming up. If reading is a path to empathy, then the way that certain books, Elena Ferrante's Neapolitan Quartet, for example, treated female friendship in a way it had never been treated before. And certainly with more diversity of working class writers of color and queer writers. I mean, I've written a lot about sex writing and how that is being done far more interestingly by authors describing queer experiences. So imagine representation wise, if you have no literature. So it is important that new books continue to get published. And as you said about the vicious circle, it's true of films, it's true of books, that if we don't give it our proper attention, then they are being designed to be casually viewed. So Netflix has a casual viewing category where the writers are instructed to have the characters describe what they're doing. So for people who are multitasking, and books aren't quite there yet, but I fear that if we aren't buying books and that, novelists can't make a living doing it, and increasingly the only thing that can keep our attention is whatever violence, say, or, not kind of the slower paced literary fiction that appeals to me, you're just going to block kind of empathy to these new voices that are dealing with the issues of our time.
Whoa, that has me leaning back in my chair. I didn't know about that. I'm not a casual TV watcher. Like it's on or it's off, and I'm watching TV or I'm not.
Yeah.
But oh my gosh. Okay, let's hope that books don't go that direction. Well, let's make sure we have a little time in our conversation to be hopeful for those people who are committed to
Yes.
readers or who hear this conversation and re-engage. I think you have a super cool job, and I would like to know some of the ways that you are intentional about creating space to read in your own life. Do you pair it with habits? Do you do it at certain times? Like, just tell us a little.
Well, I have the luxury of doing it professionally, right? Which means that I feel that my duty to my readers and to the authors I'm reviewing, as you said, it takes a lot to write a book. So I owe them my full and best attention. So, for example, if I don't care for a book, I'll make sure to read it two, if not three times, to make sure I've given it a fair shake. And in terms of my own habits, my brain works best in the morning, like a lot of people's. And so I go to the gym, I sit down, I put my phone in another room, I silence the doorbell, and I focus. And I try as much as possible to read in one sitting, which isn't always feasible if it's a 1,000-page book, say, but to have the experience of, the flow that the author wanted. And when I'm reading for work in particular, I flag my book. So I use the little post-it sticky tabs, and that kind of signals to my brain where I want to go back. And that's kind of a mnemonic device in the same way that some people would underline or write in the margins. And when I'm reading a book for review, I think my brain just goes into a mode of analysis, which doesn't mean I don't find pleasure in it, but it's forming an opinion and building an argument as I go, and kind of in a magpie way, finding quotes or places that support that argument. But you can take that into your life as well. So another one of Brandon Taylor's suggestions to read more is to, a lot of people say this, and it helps to write down after you've read, whatever appeals to you. Like, again, it's not supposed to be homework. So just a few lines on why you liked it, why you didn't like it, anything that stands out, any quotes, because that kind of grounds it in your brain. So handwriting helps us remember things. So if you find that, you've read a book and have no recollection, that can be a helpful way. And again, like you can make a nice habit out of it. You buy yourself a nice journal, reading journal, read the pen you like just honoring the process of
Yeah.
books and making it a bit sacred.
Yeah, I feel like you could just also I feel like there's times when women are in book clubs and you show up to book clubs and you're like, I like the book, and you have all these reasons, and then you're like, what were they? So I feel like that's kind of a cool practice that can just be like quick notes or like go back to this page. And it sounds like it also helps you kind of digest the information in your brain a little bit more too.
And that is a nice record, right? At the end of the year, again, like you're not going to say I spent X hundreds of hours on TikTok, right? But you can go back and say I read however many books that is, and these are the ones I liked. And that over time, like, it's just kind of a record of things that you enjoyed.
Yeah. And you
hopefully.
learned or sparked your interest or curiosity. I love that. So you have to tell us, since you do this professionally, how far are you usually into a book before you feel like you're going to like it or not?
Well, this is interesting. I just kind of liken it to sexing chickens, which I don't know if you know. So, like, if you look at baby chicks, an untrained eye can't tell if it's male or female. And chicken sexers are professionals who can tell. And it's almost like an intuitive thing. They kind of almost can't explain how they know. And so, similarly with books, like I know very quickly. Now, obviously, if I'm reading it for review, I will continue. People ask me sometimes if we read whole books. The day I file a review, having not read the book, I should be fired because that's kind of the minimum. But something will grab you. You'll like the voice, like definitely by the first page. That's not always the case. So probably of the hundreds of books that I see a year, maybe I will dismiss one. Not always, not every year, too quickly that I will come back to because somebody recommends it and I realized that I was too hasty. But more often than not, for my own personal taste. Now, again, for review, I will not be so quickly judgmental, but we have to, like, I receive tons of books every day. So, in order to make a selection, we kind of have to get good at, yeah, it's like,
Discerning.
it's like a dating app, right? Like, you have to
Yeah.
have some criteria on which to make a choice.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure that your instincts, intuition and instincts just get dialed up when you're looking at it through that lens. Well, I can't let you leave without at least sharing for those readers in my audience. Can you give us one or two? It can be fiction, it can be nonfiction, just one or two books that you've read recently that you feel like are worthwhile in case someone is listening and they're like, you know what, I'm going to go buy an actual paper book and get going on this.
Yes, fantastic. I would love that. That would make me so happy. One of my favorite books last year is called The Safe Keep by Yael van der Voden. She's a Dutch author, but who writes in English. And it is a story of post war Holland, kind of like a queer love story. But it's kind of a rare combination of literary and plotty, because usually you kind of have to make a choice. And it's just a very clever, special book. It was shortlisted for the Booker Prize last year. And, again, back to anybody who wants shorter books, New Directions has a collection of very short books called the Storybook Collection, which is very well curated. My favorite is Helen DeWitt's The English Understandable, which is kind of like a perfect little story, again, that you can read in one sitting. I love the short stories of Tessa Hadley, of Wendy Erskine, just to name a couple. Another novella that was lovely was Claire Keegan's Small Things Like These, which just recently got made into a film, an Irish author, just like pitch perfect language. And the book I mentioned earlier was The Edges by Angelo Tysons, which is this beautiful, tender gay love story, which is 89 pages. So, I think anybody can commit to 89 pages. He's a Flemish author. So it's in translation.
Thank you so much for these wonderful recommendations. I know we're up against time, but I always give my audience a chance to reflect at the end of each episode. So, in this area of less brain rot, more opening ourselves up to truly nourishing pastimes, potentially including reading, I hope. What's one question women could be asking themselves more?
I think I would just ask yourself, I think it's Annie Lamott who says, like, how we spend our days is how we spend our lives. And I think really few of us, if we had whatever, a month left, a year left, would say, like, I want to spend more time on social media. So one of the benefits of getting older is to just realize that life is finite. And that might not be reading, but just at least bringing back some intentionality into our day-to-day lives and just doing things that nourish us, as you said, whether that's reading or not, and doing one thing at a time. So back to your point, like, if you're going to be on social media, be on social media. Like, don't do it while you're watching Netflix. And so I think that if you're present to your life, and that, not always pleasant to be present, right? Like, you could have some really yucky feelings. You can be bored. You can be unhappy. You can be angry. Like, but at least you're experiencing them and not just kind of like burying them under like some brain rot content.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much for that reflection. Is there anywhere that we can follow you, support your work, and make sure we continue to hear your very thoughtful voice in the world?
I'm almost embarrassed to now plug myself on Instagram, but I will say that there are communities, Book Talk has been very influential in driving book sales among young people. So, it's not all bad. As you said, like, you're trying to promote a positive message using these platforms. I think the question really is one of intentionality. So I think Instagram's the best place to find me. That gives you a sense of what I'm reading, what I'm reviewing, what I like, what I don't like, and can follow the links to my reviews if that's of interest.
Okay. And I'm with you. I feel like if you're conscious and intentional about your consumption, it can be a small part of what you're doing day to day. Just don't let it take you over, right?
100%.
Thank you so much for being here, Mia.
Thanks for having me, Whitney. It's been such a pleasure.
I'm so glad you joined me today. If you're looking for more, feel free to connect with me on Instagram at @WhitneyWoman. And if you enjoyed the show, I invite you to support me by leaving a review or sharing it with a friend. Hope you have an inspired day.